And I want to think with you today about human rights, something, which concerns me deeply, and that drew me into my work originally, which was, we're looking at the way Muslim prisoners were treated and experienced their religion or inability to practice their religion in some cases at Guantanamo Bay, what it meant to racialize Islam in a space like Guantanamo. But so much of my work on Guantanamo, always leads me back to looking at the United States and a lot of, reflection on right, my own culture. Human rights are not something that we need to be concerned about over somewhere over there. And this is something I work with students on. We need to think about how our own culture, our own practices, our own systems do not work so often for people within our own spaces. And so I want to talk in particular about one city and four people today. The city is Chicago, although we're also going to go to North Carolina a little bit. John Burge, Richard Zulli, Mohamedou Slahi, and Jeanette Young. In 2014, as an academic who is saddled with another academic, so we've been precarious scholars off and on. We were living in Illinois, and I thought, well, great, it's 2014, and it turns out that the Amnesty International Conference was happening in Chicago that year. And I really liked the topic, which was bringing human rights home, right? Let's look at Chicago and let's look at some things happening at home. And one thing I in particular appreciated was that they were looking at these connections. And some of these connections I was already aware of because of my research on Guantanamo, things like the way, the way in which citizens in Chicago, in particular minority citizens, right, Black and brown citizens of Chicago were experiencing brutality daily, we could say, at the hands of Chicago police. And because of my own work on Guantanamo, I was aware that, guess what, there were connections between some very prominent members of the Chicago police force and the US military and US militarism. So John Burge, let's start with him. Burge was, right, the Chicago police commander, and he was a policeman for 23 years, from 1970 to 1993. And he is an example of someone who used illegal techniques that he learned in the military when he served in Vietnam, right? We use this word serve. I don't know what kind of service that was, but it's not the service I would like. I wouldn't like someone to serve that way to represent me. But he did, in fact, learn techniques of torture in Vietnam, right, as a military police officer that he brought back and then implemented in and on the streets of Chicago in places like Coleman Square, right, that was used as basically a dark site for the Chicago Police Department. This was a place where people were transported, and I've heard testimony from some of these people who have since been released, who were taken and shackled with eye bolts, subject to things like, and these are techniques, this is from Tracy Siska, the executive director of the Chicago Justice Project. Techniques included Russian roulette with pistols and shotguns, burning suspects on radiators, suffocation with typewriter covers. This is very specific, right? Beatings with phone books, and that's back in the day where, a phone book could certainly have been a weapon, and electric shocks to ears, nose, fingers, and testicles. Burge is believed to have overseen the torture of some 100 African-American men in Chicago. And he was very good, like Richard Zulli, who we'll also talk about. He was good. You can get confessions from people when you torture them. they're probably not accurate, but you can get people to confess. The year he was finally fired, the Fraternal Order of Police in Chicago, the largest organization, right, to support police officers, wanted to honor him and his legacy in this annual St. Patrick's Day parade in Chicago, right? And for me, this is a clear refutation of this idea that there's just a bad actor here and there, right? This, you know, is exemplary of how it's not a bad actor, right? Here's the whole Fraternal Order of Police going to bat for him, right? This person who has, repeatedly, right, tortured people or condoned the torture of people by his subordinates, being honored, right? He in the end, he was not honored because there was public outcry, but the Fraternal Order of Police did want to honor him. In other words, the idea that a bad cop like John Berg is simply an individual actor who, when removed, would leave the others untainted, right? Or, and that solves the problem, right? Just doesn't hold up. And then Richard Zuley, right? Richard Zuley is an example of how US policing and US imperialism work in tandem in perpetuating racialized violence. Zuley was a homicide detective for 37 years in that same Chicago Police Department. And Zuley was also part of the Naval Reserve, right? So he's got his foot in the military as well. And Zuley was another officer who was very good at getting confessions. And so when Guantanamo was opened, not the base itself, but when the prison was opened at Guantanamo in January of 2002, right, they were looking for someone to bring in to supervise interrogations. And Zuley was tapped. He was tapped precisely because of his commitment to violence, right? And it seemed that he didn't have very good or didn't care for legal ramifications of that violence. He was just going to do things his own way, and he did do things his own way, and he got confessions. So Donald Rumsfeld, right, taps Zuley. So here's another Chicago cop that with this military connection, pulled specifically because of his penchant for violence and for his willingness to step outside of legal boundaries. But at Guantanamo, he didn't even have to step outside the legal boundaries because they moved, right? They moved the markers of the boundaries. Zuley was someone who would brag about these missions he would go on with naval intelligence in Latin America, right? He had his hand in that. And he was seen as a successful cop and a successful interrogator who could be useful to the military. Okay. When he was tapped to go to Guantanamo, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld signed off on what were euphemistically called enhanced interrogation techniques, which, of course, anyone who has done any research whatsoever or just is probably a thinking, caring person knows those were not enhanced interrogation techniques. They were not best practices. They were, in fact, torture. And, we're going to go on to get that 6,000-page abstract or 6,000-page report, of which, the abstract is almost 700 pages, the Senate inquiry on torture that looks at this. One of the people that we know was subject to this enhanced torture, right, enhanced interrogation or torture was Mohamedou Slahi, who wrote Guantanamo Diaries, first issued with highly redacted, right? That was the first issuance. And then the next publication, we get the full report. And we hear from people in the military, within the military, people who either acted as whistleblowers or pushed back against these techniques, right? Stuart Couch, for example, is quoted in an article from Spencer Ackerman. I've never seen anyone stoop to these levels. It's unconscionable from a perspective of criminal prosecution or an interrogation for that matter. Couch was a former Marine lieutenant colonel and a military commissions prosecutor. Mark Fallon, deputy commander of the now shuttered Criminal Investigative Task Force on Guantanamo, said of Zuli's interrogation of Slahi, it's unconscionable from a perspective of criminal prosecution. Oh, he says it's illegal, it's immoral, it's ineffective, it's unconstitutional. So we get these, different people who are in the mix talking about these techniques that are used domestically, right? We get this circuit that comes Vietnam, right, through military lines, comes into the city of Chicago, plays out for decades and is still playing out now more through soft torture, touchless torture in Chicago still today, that then gets transported back through military lines outside of the country again. And we see these kind of routes, the circuitous routes that are never, that have still 20 years later, we're going on 20 years, it'll be 19 in January, have not been held to account, right? And as long as they're not held to account, they continue to circulate. We get just in 2019, in February, it's coming up on 2 years, the case of Anjanette Young, the fourth person, right? And Anjanette is also a victim of this kind of militarization of policing, these intertwined techniques. She has been a social worker in Chicago for 20 years. She's come home, she's changing her clothes, right? This is someone whose life's work, 20 years of helping care for the people in her community. And there's a knock on the door, but she doesn't answer the door because she's changing, right? She's not dressed. And so she's trying to throw on clothes, trying to go answer her door. And the police don't give her time, right? It wasn't a no-knock warrant, but it was a pretty quick, if you don't answer the door, we're going to break down your front door warrant. And they break in, she's not dressed, they have guns in her face, and they're using techniques as though she's the enemy, right? She's the enemy at home, right? This wouldn't have happened in a different neighborhood. And she's very clear about that. She said, had I been a white woman living, a few miles over, this would have never happened to me. They were not going to break down my door. And she protests to them. I'm not that person. That person doesn't live here. The address you want is several blocks over. And it doesn't matter. They handcuff her naked. They brandish weapons. And as in the case of Breonna Taylor, of course, they have the wrong address, right? And even though you have a different mayor there today, right? You have Lori Lightfoot who says, we're going to, open things up and things are going to get better here. They haven't gotten better, right? They're still almost 2 years later. Young is just now able to get some of the footage, right, from those body cams from the police officers. And I want us to think about I often talk about this with veterans who, some of whom will be the first to tell you, right, that veterans don't necessarily make for very good police officers specifically because of their training, right? They're trained to see, the people around them as the enemy. When they bring that back home, it gets turned on. It's still, when you think about the places the United States goes and the way people in the military are trained to see the other, that comes back home with them. But all of a sudden, it's the people in their communities. And it's very often, right, minority populations in their communities who are being over-policed, unjustly policed, and military policed in a way that is making them the enemy. So, and then I would end with, that my next move from the Chicago area was to North Carolina, where it turned out there was also the military in the backyard, right? And that military and intelligence community was operating some of those rendition flights in North Carolina. So I was able to sit on the North Carolina Commission of Inquiry on Torture, where I got to hear Mohamedou testify, right? He testified remotely from Mauritania. And once again, it was just this implication of a mundane kind of community, right? We're talking about Smithfield. It's the CIA chose it because it's in the middle of nowhere, right? And that's where they operated the flights that picked up the intelligence teams that went and rendered people like Mohamedou, who then ends up being tortured by a Chicago policeman who's in the Naval Reserve, right down in Guantanamo Bay.